How did a weapon cooked up back in the American Civil War end up making a wild comeback on modern battlefields? And get this, its creator never imagined the kind of chaos it would unleash later on. You've definitely seen versions of it in movies, games, or documentaries, but now you're about to get the real story on why the American Gatling gun has earned such a heated reputation. So let's rewind all the way to its beginning and walk through this roller coaster history. It was 1862, and Richard Jordan Gatling, yes, the name that became legend, designed what would soon change warfare forever. People claimed he approached it from a humanitarian angle after seeing soldiers torn up on both sides of the Civil War, injuries so brutal that doctors back then had no real way of treating them. According to old stories, Gatling believed that if one machine could fire like dozens of men, maybe fewer soldiers would have to step onto the field in the first place. That strange mix of logic and ambition pushed him to create his rotating beast of a weapon. Depending on which model you looked at, the Gatling gun came with 4, 6, or even 10 barrels spinning around a central shaft like some early mechanical monster ready to roar. When the operator cranked the handle, the whole system came alive, feeding, firing, and ejecting rounds in a flawless mechanical rhythm that nobody had ever seen before. Each barrel fired at a certain point in its spin, then looped around for another shot as long as someone kept those ammo feeds coming. Compared to the old-school volley guns, which were basically several single-shot barrels tied together like a desperate shortcut, the Gatling gun was on a whole different level. Volley guns still had to be loaded one muzzle at a time like regular muskets, which slowed everything to a crawl, but the Gatling gun kept spitting rounds non-stop. And once stronger, standardized cartridges like the 45-70 showed up, the Gatling became even more serious, faster, smoother, deadlier, and impossible to ignore on any battlefield. Feeding this monster was the real headache in the beginning, because there were no belts, no slick magazines, nothing fancy at all. The first fix was a gravity-fed hopper slapped on top, where loose rounds just dropped into the guts of the machine one by one like coins into a metal beast. Even with that simple setup, early Gatling guns were already hitting around 200 rounds per minute, and later versions pushed even higher. To put that into perspective, muskets of the time were struggling to spit out 3 shots a minute, so the gap was wild. Even when rifles improved, they still couldn't come close to what the Gatling was throwing down range. Soon people upgraded the feeding game with the Bruce feed, a setup with 2 staggered rows of ACT 45-70 rounds that kept the gun firing non-stop as long as someone kept feeding it like a hungry machine that refused to rest. With that upgrade, the Gatling could now push nearly 400 rounds per minute, which sounded unreal for that era. But when Gatling took this invention to the Union Army, he ran straight into walls of doubt and old-school thinking. Civil War commanders were stuck in their ways, clinging to outdated tactics from the Napoleon-era tight lines of troops marching across open fields like nothing had changed, even though the battlefield was turning into something far more brutal. They also freaked out about the logistics of a weapon that ate ammunition like a starved animal. Add in early mechanical hiccups, and many officers just didn't believe this strange rotating gun could handle real combat without jamming at the worst moment. On top of all that, rumors floated around that Gatling tried selling his creation to both the Union and the Confederacy, which didn't help his standing with Union leadership. So instead of the Army officially adopting it, a handful of bold officers pulled cash from their own pockets or rallied private donors to buy a few Gatling guns themselves. Each gun cost around $1,000 back then, which is roughly $35,000 today, so it wasn't a cheap gamble. Because of that resistance, the Gatling didn't become a major star of the Civil War. But wherever it did show up, it made a serious impact. It tore apart infantry and cavalry charges and blasted defensive lines so hard that enemy soldiers couldn't even lift their heads to shoot back. Even though the Gatling gun earned a wild reputation fast, it showed up too late to truly change the end of the Civil War. After the fighting stopped, these heavy machines were usually locked onto fixed defensive spots or mounted on gunboats because they were way too bulky to run alongside infantry or cavalry. Still, wherever a Gatling gun sat, people thought twice before getting brave. Its mere shadow could shut down an attack before it even started. Everybody already knew the ugly truth. Charging a machine gun position was a one-way trip, yet somehow armies kept repeating that same mistake throughout history. Foreign militaries watched closely and realized they needed this new American creation too, so the Gatling gun became one of the first U.S. weapons to spread across the globe. Imperial Russia and the British Empire quickly snatched them up. The British even used Gatlings in their colonial wars, firing against warriors, still fighting with spears and swords, turning small British squads into forces strong enough to hold off huge waves of fighters, thanks to that brutal rate of fire. By the 1,880 seconds, the Gatling gun had earned a legendary name. But then something appeared that changed everything overnight. In 1884, Hiram Maxim stepped forward with a brand new monster, the Maxim gun, the first fully automatic machine gun the world had ever seen. Instead of relying on a crank and multiple barrels, Maxim used the recoil from each shot to work the entire action, ejecting the empty casing and loading a new round from a belt like clockwork. Suddenly, the old-school Gatling system looked slow and outdated. Maxim's design used just one barrel wrapped in a water jacket, letting the gun fire long bursts without cooking itself into failure. And unlike the Gatling, the operator didn't need to spin anything, just hold the trigger and let the machine do the rest. By the early 1900s, every major military had its own version of the Maxim, and the Gatling gun was shoved into storage, left to gather dust like some forgotten relic. But none of them had a clue that something completely unexpected would drag this old Civil War invention back into the spotlight in a form nobody could have dreamed of. The world had already seen machine guns change everything in World War I, turning battlefields into brutal stalemates of trenches and endless fire, and the next surprise in the Gatling story was about to be even bigger. Machine gun nests turned into straight-up nightmares on the battlefield because no side could figure out a clean way to break through them. Every attempt, no matter how strong, ended the same way, troops getting wiped out by non-stop automatic fire before they even got close. As the years rolled on after World War I, machine guns evolved fast, shifting from those heavy water-cooled Maxims into lighter, air-cooled weapons fed by belts or magazines that fired just as fast, sometimes even faster. Meanwhile, the whole world of warfare was changing, with tanks rolling out and aircraft becoming the new kings of the sky. And here's the wild twist: nobody expected fighter planes to be the ones to drag the Gatling gun back from the dead. Even crazier, it would be jet fighters, yes, the top-tier, cutting-edge machines of the era that would end up needing a design born back in the days of muskets and swords. So how did this old-school invention suddenly matter again? Let's break it down. During World War II, fighter planes kept getting faster and heavier, loaded with single-barrel heavy machine guns or small autocannons like 20mm or 30mm calibers. Whether they were hitting ground targets or battling enemy fighters, their biggest problem was time. These planes moved so fast that pilots only had a tiny window, sometimes just a second or two, to fire when an enemy lined up in their sights. In that blink of time, they needed to unleash as many rounds as possible to have a real chance of hitting and damaging the enemy enough to take them down. With piston-engine fighters, one solution was to stuff more guns into the wings. Americans even packed 6 or 8 heavy, 50-caliber M2 machine guns tuned to fire faster. Together, they could spit out around 4,500 rounds per minute, which sounded impressive, but it came with serious problems. All those guns added weight, took up precious space inside the plane, and forced pilots to carry less total ammunition. That meant they only had around 10 to 15 seconds of actual firing time before going empty, which is nothing in a real dogfight. And just when engineers thought things couldn't get trickier, jet fighters showed up, and suddenly the old problems got a whole lot worse. Jet fighters were now blazing across the sky way faster than any propeller plane ever could, and the moment they entered real combat, the older fighters were instantly outdated. But even with this jump in speed, one huge problem stuck around: how to arm these new jets well enough to take down other jets that were just as fast. Since every aircraft was now moving at incredible speeds, the tiny window of time to land a hit shrank to almost nothing. Pilots couldn't just bolt on more machine guns to fix it, so engineers were stuck trying to solve a problem that seemed impossible. And here's where things take a wild turn, something the original designer of the Gatling gun would have never believed. Someone seriously suggested bringing back that old-school multi-barrel rotary concept and adapting it for jet fighters. Only this time, the barrels wouldn't be spun by a pilot cranking a handle, they'd be powered by an electric motor. Funny enough, Gatling himself had experimented with electric operation way back in the day, but the technology just wasn't ready yet. Now the idea was back, and it actually had a purpose. The American 50 caliber machine guns on early jets were firing fast, but they didn't hit hard enough to reliably take down enemy aircraft anymore. The military realized they needed heavier autocannons, but those came with their own issues, like unreliable magazines and a slower fire rate that wasn't good enough for high-speed dogfights. So, while hunting for a weapon that could fire huge shells insanely fast, someone looked at that 19th century design and said, "Why not bring this beast back?" And that spark of inspiration kicked off something legendary. In 1946, the USS Air Force launched a secretive program called Project Vulcan, aiming to build a 6-barrel, 20mm rotary cannon that could unleash a staggering 6,000 to 7,000 rounds per minute. This was basically the Gatling gun reborn, supercharged, electrified, and engineered for jet combat. With multiple barrels rotating at high speed, they could dump out an unbelievable amount of fire without melting a single barrel, something no traditional single-barrel cannon could dream of surviving. Each barrel on this new system would fire, then rotate out of the hot spot just long enough to cool down, keeping the whole weapon from cooking itself into failure. The feeding setup inside the aircraft was just as clever, built to work smoothly in tight space while keeping that classic Gatling-style reliability alive. This thing was so dependable that tests showed it could fire over 10,000 rounds between failures, which is unbelievable for such a high-stress machine. But there was another big issue. Traditional belts used metal links that got tossed out during firing, and aircraft couldn't risk hot metal flying around and smashing into the fuselage. So engineers created a linkless feed system, basically a revolving drum that pushed fresh rounds forward and then sucked the empty casings back inside, keeping everything contained and clean inside the jet. All this genius engineering led to the birth of the M61 Vulcan, first fitted to U.S. fighter jets in the late 1950 seconds. This cannon could unleash around 100 rounds per second, which is wild when you think about it. But since fighters only carried around 500–1,000 rounds depending on the model, pilots had to fire short, controlled bursts and make every shot count. The first jet to carry the Vulcan in its nose was the F-104 Starfighter, and from there it spread fast, quickly becoming standard gear on American fighters. The Vulcan got its first real test in the Vietnam War, where it scored its first air-to-air kill by shredding Soviet-supplied MiG fighters. With its tight shot grouping and insane rate of fire, this cannon could rip through an enemy plane like it was made of paper. Pilots loved it because it didn't just work, it dominated. And on the ground, the Vulcan was just as terrifying, laying down brutal strafing fire that could tear up vehicles, tanks, and anything unlucky enough to be under the jet's path. Once people saw how effective the concept was, it was obvious the Gatling design wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. That's when engineers started thinking bigger. What other calibers could use this system? And what other machines could they mount it on? This kicked off an entire family of wild Gatling-style weapons. As the Vietnam War heated up, the M134 minigun was born, called Mini, only because it was small compared to the Vulcan. It used the same multi-barrel concept but fired 7.62 NATO rounds, making it perfect for close-range chaos. It was first attached to Huey helicopters for protection, but crews quickly realized it was perfect for the Cobra gunship too. These miniguns became legends on the battlefield, laying down support fire for troops on the ground or keeping helicopters alive during dangerous landings and evacuations where every second counted. Miniguns unleashed around 6,000 rounds per minute, blowing past anything the M60 door gunners could ever dream of matching. The North Vietnamese quickly figured out that hiding in the jungle didn't mean much when the jungle itself was getting shredded like paper under a storm of bullets. The minigun had that famous brrr sound, rounds firing so close together that it turned into one non-stop roar, like somebody blasting a hose of metal straight into the trees. The stream of tracer rounds looked almost like a glowing laser ripping across the sky, even though each tracer was only every fifth shot, meaning 4 more invisible rounds were slicing through the air in between every one you could actually see. Imagine being stuck on the receiving end of that kind of firepower. It must have felt like the world was collapsing around you. But the U.S. Air Force didn't stop at helicopters, far from it. This was just the starting point of what the Gatling concept would become as engineers kept pushing things to a whole new level. Soon came the legendary AC-47 Spooky, a modified C-47 cargo plane fitted with three M134 miniguns, all firing out the left side of the aircraft. The plane would circle the target like a silent predator, blasting out non-stop fire until the entire area was lit up. There's a story from one night in 1969 where an AC-47 dumped 63,000 rounds to save a South Vietnamese outpost from being overrun, an unbelievable amount of fire pouring from a single plane. Another report described a Spooky circling a Viet Cong force on a hillside for hours, unloading over 20,000 rounds and taking out around 300 fighters. One chilling description said, quote, "Nothing of flesh survived the impact zone. These planes hovered over bases that were at risk of being overwhelmed and delivered such massive firepower that attackers simply couldn't push forward. The concept worked so well that engineers expanded it into even bigger monsters, the AC-119 and AC-130 gunships. These beasts carried combinations like 4 M134 miniguns and 4 20mm Vulcan cannons, and the amount of fire all 8 barrels could unleash together was something you didn't want to see up close. When that kind of volume hit a target, the impact was so extreme that people often got hit multiple times in the same burst, and the injuries were best left undescribed because of how destructive they were. Then came the question, where else could they mount these Gatling-style weapons? Soon they were showing up on vehicles and boats as well. River patrol boats in the Mekong Delta tested M134 miniguns, turning them into floating firestorms ready to defend against ambushes along the narrow waterways. Some cargo convoys even rolled with gun trucks equipped with these weapons, protecting supply routes with raw firepower that could shred an ambush before it even fully formed. And check this out. American forces even mounted a 20mm Vulcan on an M113 armored personnel carrier, turning it into a mobile fire-breathing platform. It was meant for shooting at low-flying aircraft. But in Vietnam, soldiers could angle that thing at almost anything on the ground they needed, gone in a hurry. And the results were devastating. The United States cranked out around 10,000 miniguns during the Vietnam War, testing them in all kinds of forms and setups. But once the war ended, the whole Gatling concept leveled up in a way nobody was ready for. This is when engineers grabbed the GAU-8A Avenger, a massive 30mm, 7-barreled Gatling cannon built in the 1,970 seconds, and literally designed an entire fighter jet around the gun. Yes, seriously, the jet existed because of the gun, not the other way around. This wild idea turned into the A-10 Thunderbolt II, better known as the Warthog, one of the most iconic ground attack aircraft ever created. The GAU-8 isn't just a bigger Vulcan, it's a giant compared to it, weighing roughly 1,800 kilograms. Once you include its huge drum and feed system, carrying 1,150 rounds of 30 x 173mm ammunition. The cannon fires about 3,900 rounds per minute, around 65 rounds every second, with specialized high-explosive and armor-piercing ammo built to tear through the toughest targets on a battlefield. This monster wasn't designed for show, it was built during the Cold War specifically to counter massive waves of Soviet tanks pushing across Europe. The engineers even developed a depleted uranium armor-piercing round that hits with unbelievable force. Now, modern tanks can take a hit from a 30mm shell if it slams into the front armor, that's the strongest part. But the Warthog doesn't attack from the front. It swoops down from above and rains fire onto the top of the tank, where the armor is weakest. With dozens of rounds hitting the same target, it only takes one solid impact to put that tank out of the fight. The Warthog entered combat in the Gulf War and went on to destroy hundreds of ground targets, including tanks with surgical precision and raw firepower that shocked enemy forces. Yet even this wasn't the final chapter in Gatling-style evolution. Naval forces took the concept and upgraded it for ocean warfare. The U.S. Navy introduced the Phalanx CIWS close-in weapon system. In 1980, a fully automated, radar-guided Vulcan cannon mounted in a rotating turret that acts as the ship's last-chance shield. This system can detect and shoot down incoming anti-ship missiles before they reach the vessel, blasting them out of the sky with rapid-fire bursts. Beyond that, engineers also experimented with the micro-Gatling, basically a minigun scaled down to fire 5.56mm rounds at a mind-blowing 10,000 rounds per minute. It never became widely adopted, but the concept proved just how far the Gatling idea could stretch. There's even a Gatling chambered in 50 BMG, though the M134 variants remain the most commonly mounted versions on vehicles due to their balance of firepower and weight. You'll spot these Gatling-style weapons on Humvees and all kinds of similar platforms today, which makes the whole story pretty ironic when you think about it. Gatling originally hoped his invention would reduce casualties in war, but the machine he created ended up doing the complete opposite. It became one of the most destructive tools in military history and continues to hit with frightening effectiveness even now. And the evolution didn't just stop at ground vehicles or helicopters. This design got pushed so far that it ended up riding on fighter jets, something nobody from Gatling's era could have even pictured in their wildest dreams. Watching a 19th century idea power some of the most advanced weapons on the planet is a twist that feels straight out of a movie. How long will the Gatling-style design keep dominating? Nobody knows for sure, but one thing is crystal clear. It's not slowing down or heading into retirement anytime soon.